Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt like something was staring back? Not just your reflection, but something darker, something alive. Ethan Caldwell had always been curious, a student of ancient myths and forgotten rituals. But curiosity can be dangerous. On an otherwise uneventful night, Ethan and his friends gathered in his small, dimly lit apartment. The air felt thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin crawl before something terrible happens. They were about to perform an ancient ritual, one they found buried in the back of an obscure book about occult practices. A ritual that involved a mirror, a simple, everyday object that would soon become their worst nightmare. The instructions were simple, almost too simple. Stand before the mirror at midnight, in total silence, and chant a phrase that supposedly opens a door between our world and whatever lies on the other side of the glass. But what they didn't know is that some doors should never be opened. Ethan had always laughed at superstitions, dismissing them as old tales. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, something inside him stirred, an instinctive fear, like prey sensing a predator. His reflection, just a few feet away, seemed off. It mirrored his every movement, but there was a faint delay, like a glitch in reality. As he and his friends chanted the strange words, the atmosphere in the room changed. A coldness crept in, though the windows were shut tight. Their breath fogged in the air, and the dim candlelight flickered, as if struggling to stay alive. Ethan glanced at his friends, but they didn't seem to notice. His heart raced as he looked back at the mirror. The reflection wasn't just late, it was wrong. His own eyes, staring back at him, seemed darker, emptier, as if something had hollowed him out from the inside. And then it happened. His reflection smiled, a slow, twisted grin that spread across his face in the mirror while his own lips remained motionless. Ethan's stomach churned as his mind raced for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew. Something had crossed over, something that didn't belong here. He felt it, an oppressive, unseen force pressing down on him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Before he could say anything, the reflection shifted again, this time reflecting not just him, but something else. A shadowy figure, just out of focus, standing behind him in the mirror, but not in the room. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat as terror gripped him, and he realized they had made a terrible mistake. If you're ready to unravel the nightmare Ethan and his friends unleashed, make sure to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and brace yourself for what's about to come. This is just the beginning of a descent into a world where reality and reflection blur, and the things we see in the mirror may be far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The ritual had begun. Ethan stood motionless before the mirror, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the room. The air grew thicker with every passing second, heavy with the scent of burning sage and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. His friends were gathered around him, their faces tense but intrigued. The mirror stood tall in front of them, its surface unnervingly smooth, reflecting more than just their figures. As they chanted the ancient phrase, the room seemed to close in on itself, as if reality was bending around them. The words, foreign and guttural, echoed unnaturally, growing louder, though no one was raising their voice. Ethan felt a shiver crawl up his spine, like icy fingers brushing against his skin. His breath caught in his throat as the atmosphere shifted, an unexplainable dread settling over the room. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and a low hum began to resonate from the mirror. It wasn't just a sound, but a feeling deep in his bones, a vibration that rattled through his chest. His hands began to tremble, though he tried to steady them. There was something deeply wrong, and the mirror no longer felt like an ordinary object. It felt alive. The reflection before him started to waver, as if it were a rippling pool of water, distorting their images into twisted, grotesque versions of themselves. Then, the smell hit him. It wasn't just a sage anymore. There was a sickly sweetness in the air, mixed with the coppery tang of blood. Ethan's stomach churned as the scent grew stronger. He glanced at his friends, but none of them seemed to notice. Their faces were glued to the mirror, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, like they were caught in a trance. He wanted to say something, to tell them to stop, but the words died in his throat. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite right. The eyes were darker, more hollow, and a cold smile began to curl at the corners of its lips. Suddenly, the mirror began to tremble, ever so slightly at first, then more violently, like it was reacting to their presence. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest, but his reflection stayed perfectly still, that eerie smile now fully formed. It was as if the reflection was no longer bound to him, no longer under his control. And then, without warning, the reflection took a step forward. Not Ethan, but the version of him inside the mirror. It moved on its own, the grin widening into something monstrous, as though whatever was in the mirror had just been released. A chilling breeze swept through the room, despite the closed windows and the sealed door. The candles flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to crawl up the walls. Ethan's heart raced as he glanced around, trying to find the source of the wind, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence that followed. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, louder than anything else. And then the whispering began, faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakably coming from the mirror. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, layered on top of each other, hissing unintelligible words, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan felt his skin prickle with fear, his instinct screaming at him to run, to get away from that cursed mirror. But his feet were rooted to the ground, as though an invisible force was holding him in place. The whispers turned into murmurs, then into a cacophony of voices, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The reflection that had stepped forward in the mirror now stared directly at Ethan, its eyes gleaming with malice. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, it spoke. "We see you." A jolt of terror shot through Ethan's body, and he staggered back, his mind racing to make sense of what just happened. But there was no explanation, only fear. The mirror, once just an object of curiosity, had become a gateway. Something ancient and malevolent was watching them now, lurking just beyond the glass. And it wasn't going to stop. If you're ready to uncover the horrifying truth behind Ethan's encounter with the mirror and the dark force that's been unleashed, hit that subscribe button, like the video, and stay with us for the next chapter. The nightmare has only just begun, and what waits behind the mirror may already be closer than you think. The room had fallen into an eerie stillness, but the tension was unbearable, a thick and suffocating presence that seemed to press in from all sides. Ethan's eyes were glued to the mirror, his heart racing in his chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The reflection that had spoken was still there, staring back at him with eyes that didn't belong to him. He wanted to tear his gaze away, to look anywhere else, but he couldn't. It was as if the mirror had him in its grip, pulling him deeper into its dark, twisted world. Around him, his friends remained disturbingly quiet, their faces blank and emotionless, as if they, too, were trapped in the mirror's spell. Suddenly, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room. It was coming from the mirror, a slow, deliberate sound, like fingernails tapping against glass. Ethan's breath hitched. His reflection hadn't moved, but there was no mistaking the sound. It was coming from inside the mirror. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and with each tap, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. He could see his breath now, a thin mist forming in the icy air, swirling up toward the mirror like smoke drawn into a flame. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed something else, movement. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a flicker of motion in the reflection behind him. But as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. There, in the reflection, was a figure. It was standing in the shadows, just behind his friends, its form barely visible in the dim light. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned his head quickly, his eyes scanning the room behind him. But there was no one there. The figure only existed in the mirror, a dark silhouette watching them from the other side. Its face was obscured, but Ethan could feel its gaze, cold and menacing, locked onto him. The figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, inching closer to his friends in the reflection. Ethan's throat tightened in panic. He wanted to scream, to warn them, but no sound escaped his lips. The room seemed frozen in time, as if reality itself had been twisted by the mirror's influence. The tapping continued, louder now, almost aggressive. It was as if the figure was trying to break through the glass, to reach them. Ethan's chest tightened as a wave of nausea washed over him. The figure stopped, standing directly behind Lily, its shadowy hand slowly rising, reaching for her shoulder in the reflection. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears as the tension mounted, the room growing impossibly cold. He blinked, and in that brief moment, the figure vanished. But the sense of dread didn't leave. Instead, it grew, a suffocating presence that filled the air with palpable fear. The candles flickered violently, as if about to be snuffed out by an unseen hand. Ethan turned back to the mirror, and what he saw made his blood run cold. His reflection had changed again. His eyes, hollow and empty, stared back at him with a malevolent grin stretching across his face. But worse than that, his friends' reflections were no longer their own. Each one of them was twisted, distorted, their faces elongated, and their expressions grotesque. Lily's eyes had turned completely black, two voids staring blankly into the mirror. Mike's mouth hung open unnaturally wide, frozen in a silent scream. Ethan's legs trembled beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. It shouldn't be real. The reflections were wrong, horribly wrong, and the oppressive weight of the mirror's presence bore down on him like a lead blanket. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. Just when Ethan thought the horror couldn't intensify, the surface of the mirror began to ripple like water. It was subtle at first, but then the ripples grew larger, distorting the reflections even more. His reflection smiled wider, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim candlelight. Ethan's hand shook uncontrollably as he stepped back, the sense of danger now overwhelming. The mirror wasn't just reflecting their images, it was warping reality itself. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, primal fear that something was coming. Something was crossing over. And then, without warning, the mirror cracked. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, the sharp noise shattering the oppressive silence. A jagged line splintered across the surface, right through Ethan's reflection. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. But even as the mirror cracked, the reflection didn't disappear. Instead, it lingered, staring at him through the fractured glass, that same twisted grin on its face. The room around him seemed to pulse, the atmosphere growing darker, heavier, as if the mirror was feeding on their fear. Ethan knew, in that moment, that they had gone too far. They had opened a door to something they couldn't control, something that was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And now, it was too late to turn back. What they had summoned wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Something that wanted to escape. And it wasn't going to stop until it did. If you're ready to dive deeper into the nightmare, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. This is only the beginning. The mirror isn't finished with them yet, and neither is the darkness that waits on the other side. The room was silent, yet the echo of the mirror's crack seemed to linger, reverberating through Ethan's mind. He stood frozen, heart pounding in his chest, as the jagged fractures spread across the glass like a spider's web. Each line seemed to pulse with a dark energy, distorting the reflection beyond recognition. His friends were still in place, their faces eerily calm, oblivious to the terror unfolding around them. But Ethan knew. Something had changed. Something had crossed over. The mirror was no longer a mere object. It had become a portal, a gateway to something far darker. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, a biting cold that cut through Ethan's skin and chilled him to the bone. His breath escaped in shallow, visible puffs as the atmosphere thickened, growing impossibly heavy, as though the very air had turned to lead. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, creeping along the walls, drawn toward the fractured mirror like moths to a flame. Ethan's reflection, now barely recognizable through the cracks, shifted once more. His eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Then, without warning, the reflection stepped forward, shattering the boundary between the world of glass and reality. The room plunged into chaos. The reflection moved toward Ethan, its form flickering like a broken image in a nightmare. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent, a twisted version of himself that had broken free. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the room warping in a dizzying swirl of shadows and light. The walls buckled, groaning under the weight of the malevolent force that now filled the space. His friends, still unmoving, began to distort as well. Their bodies twisted and elongated in the reflection, limbs stretching unnaturally as their faces warped into grotesque, otherworldly masks. Ethan tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound escaped his throat. It was as though the air itself had been stolen from his lungs. His vision blurred as the shadows in the room grew thicker, swallowing the light and pulling him deeper into their suffocating embrace. The reflection, his asterisk reflection, was now mere inches away, its twisted grin widening as it reached out a hand toward him. Ethan stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the room had become a labyrinth of darkness, the walls warping and shifting in impossible ways. And then it happened. The reflection touched him. A cold, searing pain shot through Ethan's body, freezing him in place. It felt as if ice had crawled into his veins, spreading through every nerve, paralyzing him in a vice-like grip. The world around him began to fade, the colors draining from reality, until all that was left was darkness. But even in the black void, he could feel the reflection's presence, its malevolent gaze burning into him, pulling him into the abyss. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as the mirror's power consumed him. The voices from earlier returned, whispers, murmurs, growing louder, more insistent, echoing in his mind. Suddenly, Ethan was yanked back, violently, into reality. He gasped for air, collapsing to his knees as the oppressive weight of the mirror's influence lifted, if only slightly. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs, and his skin was slick with cold sweat. He looked around frantically, trying to regain his bearings. The room was still, but the energy had shifted. His friends, finally breaking free from their trance-like state, stirred in confusion, their eyes wide with fear. They had felt it too, the malevolence, the darkness that had seeped into their world. But something was wrong. The mirror was still cracked, but it no longer reflected any of them. It showed something else. A world on the other side, twisted and dark, where shadows moved independently and the sky hung in a constant, unnatural twilight. And then Ethan saw it. His reflection was still in that world, grinning back at him. It wasn't just trapped there. It was waiting. Desperately, Ethan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get away from the mirror, to escape the horror that had been unleashed. But before he could move, he felt it. A presence behind him. His heart stopped as icy fingers grazed the back of his neck, and a soft, breathy whisper filled his ear. "It's not over." In a flash, Ethan spun around, but nothing was there, just the dark, empty room. His friends stared at him, their faces pale, fear etched into every feature. But Ethan knew, deep down, that the nightmare wasn't over. Something had followed him back from the other side, something that wasn't bound by the mirror anymore. And as he looked at the cracked glass one final time, he realized with growing horror that the reflection was still moving. But this time, it wasn't just him in the mirror. It was all of them. If you're ready to follow Ethan's terrifying descent into madness, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. This is only the beginning of a horror that reaches far beyond the glass. Something far darker is waiting, and it's already crossed into our world. Ethan's heart hadn't slowed since that night, and the haunting memory of the mirror's crack echoed in his mind. Days had passed, but the feeling of being watched clung to him like a second shadow. Every reflective surface in his apartment, windows, the bathroom mirror, even the shiny chrome of the kitchen sink, seemed to ripple with unseen movement just at the edge of his vision. It was subtle at first, but it grew more persistent, like something inside those reflections was trying to break through again. Each time he caught his own reflection, his stomach churned with fear, expecting to see that twisted version of himself, grinning back at him. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror had left a mark on him. Not just a psychological one, but something real, something physical. His eyes, once bright, now carried dark shadows beneath them. He hadn't slept well since that night, and every dream felt like a continuation of the nightmare that had begun in front of the mirror. But what truly unnerved him was the nagging sensation that something had crossed into his world, a presence that wasn't supposed to be here. He could feel it lingering, watching, waiting. Determined to understand what had happened, Ethan began researching the ritual they had performed. He scoured old books, obscure forums, and dark corners of the internet. The deeper he dug, the more horrifying the truth became. The ritual was no urban legend. It had roots in an ancient practice designed not to reveal hidden truths, but to trap them. Mirrors, it turned out, were seen by many ancient cultures as portals, doorways to other realms, and some believed that these realms held entities capable of mimicking human forms, waiting for the right moment to cross into our world. The discovery chilled him to the core. He realized that they hadn't just seen their reflections, they had invited something through. Something malevolent, something that had been waiting on the other side of the glass for centuries. The reflection that had smiled at him was no ordinary reflection. It was a twisted copy, a doppelganger that sought to replace him. And what was worse, he wasn't the first to experience this. There were stories scattered across time of people who had vanished after performing similar mirror rituals. Their disappearances were always unexplained, their mirrors found shattered with no sign of struggle. Ethan's mind raced as the pieces started to fit together. He thought back to his friends, Lily, Mike, and the others. They had all been there with him, and each one of them had seen the same thing. But now, their reflections weren't just confined to mirrors anymore. He had noticed it that morning when he passed Mike in the hallway of their apartment building. Mike had smiled at him, a perfectly normal smile, but it lingered too long, just like the reflection in the mirror had. And his eyes, they had been too dark, too hollow. It was as if Mike's reflection had become him. Panicking, Ethan reached out to Lily. He had to know if she had noticed the same strange behavior. When she answered the phone, her voice was distant, cold. She barely remembered the events of that night, claiming she must have been too tired or drunk to recall much. But Ethan knew better. He could hear it in her voice. The way she spoke was too detached, too emotionless. It wasn't the Lily he knew. Something was wrong, horribly wrong, and it wasn't just in his head. The mirror hadn't just affected him. It had touched all of them, and now they were all being slowly consumed by whatever had crossed over. Desperate for answers, Ethan sought out the only person he thought might know what to do, an old professor who specialized in folklore and the occult. The man was reclusive, eccentric, and often dismissed as a crackpot by his peers, but Ethan didn't care. He needed help, and fast. When Ethan explained the situation, the professor's face turned ashen. He recognized the ritual immediately, warning Ethan that it was far more dangerous than they had realized. The mirror wasn't just a doorway. It was a trap, designed to lure curious souls into its reflection world, where they would be slowly replaced by their doppelgangers. The professor's next words sent a chill through Ethan's body. If your friends are acting strange, it's already too late. The reflections are taking over. Soon, they'll fully replace them. And once that happens, there's no coming back. Ethan's heart sank. The professor explained that the only way to stop the process was to destroy the mirror completely, but not just the one they had used. Every reflective surface in their homes, their lives, had become a conduit for the entity. Breaking the mirrors wouldn't stop it either. Ethan had to confront the original mirror, the one they had summoned the entity from, and perform a ritual to send it back. But the risk was immense. If he failed, his own reflection would consume him, trapping him in the mirror world forever. The connection between the ritual and the real world was undeniable. The events that had followed, the strange behavior, the lingering shadows, the whispers that followed Ethan everywhere he went, were all pieces of a larger puzzle. The mirror had opened a doorway, and now the doppelgangers were walking among them, hiding in plain sight. Ethan had to act fast, or he and his friends would be lost forever, their real selves consumed by the twisted versions lurking in the reflections. As Ethan left the professor's house, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The sun had set, and the street lights cast long, dark shadows on the pavement. He caught his reflection in the window of a passing car and froze. There, in the glass, his reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, its eyes were filled with something far worse than a grin: hunger. If you're ready to follow Ethan's descent into the world of reflections and the horror that's overtaking his reality, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment your theories. The mirror is far from finished, and the doppelgangers, they're still waiting. Ethan's life had become a waking nightmare. Every moment felt like he was teetering on the edge of an abyss, unable to escape the oppressive presence of the reflection world that had bled into his reality. His friends, once so familiar and warm, now seemed like strangers, dark, twisted imitations of themselves. Their behavior grew more erratic with each passing day. Lily, once vibrant and full of life, now moved through the world like a puppet, her eyes glazed over with an unsettling emptiness. Mike's laughter had a hollow ring to it, echoing with a coldness that chilled Ethan to his core. They weren't themselves anymore, but they didn't seem to realize it. Ethan was alone, the only one who could see the truth. He couldn't shake the feeling that his own reflection was watching him, even when there were no mirrors around. Shadows stretched longer than they should, always looming in his peripheral vision, and the faint sound of tapping followed him everywhere, like something was just beyond the surface, trying to break through. At night, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Ethan could swear he heard whispers beneath it, voices calling out from the other side. His apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a prison. Every reflective surface, windows, glass, even the polished wood of the coffee table, was a potential doorway to the horror that stalked him. Desperation gnawed at his sanity, and Ethan knew he had to find answers before the mirror took everything from him. The professor's warning echoed in his mind. If your friends are changing, it's already begun. Time was running out. Determined to stop the invasion before it consumed him entirely, Ethan began a relentless search for any scrap of information that might help. He delved into the darkest corners of the occult, chasing rumors of rituals and legends that had been long forgotten. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the forces they had unleashed were beyond comprehension, ancient, malevolent, and hungry. In his search, Ethan stumbled upon a name: the Keeper of Mirrors, an entity as old as time, rumored to live within the reflections, feeding off the souls of those who dared summon it. The legend spoke of a way to confront the Keeper, but it came at a terrible cost. Those who faced the entity rarely returned, and those who did were never the same. Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the final warning. To defeat the Keeper, you must face your reflection and choose. What the choice entailed was unclear, but the stakes were undeniable. If he failed, he would be trapped in the reflection world, his place in reality taken by the doppelganger that already stalked his every move. But Ethan couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone who knew the ancient rituals better than anyone else. It was then that he remembered a name from his university days: Professor Aldrich, a scholar of the occult who had once been dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Ethan had heard rumors about the professor, whispers of his dealings with dangerous rituals and forbidden knowledge. If anyone knew how to stop this, it would be him. Ethan tracked Professor Aldrich down to a small, cluttered office hidden away in the bowels of an old, forgotten building on campus. The walls were lined with dusty tomes and strange artifacts, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and incense. Aldrich, A gaunt man with piercing eyes listened quietly as Ethan recounted the events, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, the professor leaned back, his gaze hardening. "You already crossed into dangerous territory," Aldrich said, his voice low and gravelly. "The mirror has you now. It won't stop until it consumes you, unless you confront it." Aldrich explained that the mirror's power wasn't just in its reflection. It was a bridge between worlds, a gateway for the Keeper to step through and replace those foolish enough to summon it. "The doppelgangers," Aldrich continued, "are fragments of the Keeper itself, shadow versions of the people it seeks to replace. They will become stronger, more real, the longer you wait." The professor revealed an ancient ritual that might banish the Keeper back into the mirror world, but was dangerous. One misstep and Ethan would be lost forever, his soul consumed by the very thing he was trying to defeat. To perform the ritual, Ethan would need to gather specific items: a shard from the original cracked mirror, black candles infused with salt, and a sacred talisman that would protect him from the Keeper's influence. But most importantly, he would need the participation of his friends, the ones who had summoned the mirror in the first place. They had to be there, standing with him, or the ritual would fail. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. How could he convince them to help when they were already under the mirror's influence, their souls slowly being consumed by the doppelgangers? As the days passed, Ethan's paranoia deepened. He watched his friends carefully, trying to discern whether the people standing before him were still real, or if they had already been replaced. Every smile seemed too wide, every laugh too sharp, and their eyes, those dark, empty eyes, haunted him. The more he stared, the less human they seemed. Time was slipping away, and Ethan knew he had no choice but to act soon. The mirror had crossed into their reality, and if he didn't stop it, it would take him next. One night, as Ethan prepared the materials for the ritual, he caught a glimpse of himself in the kitchen window. His reflection stared back at him, unmoving, even though he had turned away. His heart pounded as he stepped closer, his breath fogging up the glass. The reflection smiled, not a friendly smile, but a malicious, knowing grin, as if it already knew how this would end. Ethan's stomach twisted in fear. His reflection was waiting, and soon it would come for him. If you're ready to watch Ethan's final attempt to rid himself of the mirror's curse, hit the like button and subscribe. The mirror is watching, and the Keeper is coming. Will Ethan survive the confrontation, or will his reflection replace him before it's too late? The night had come. Ethan stood in the dimly lit room where it all began, the cracked mirror looming before him like a malevolent presence. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the suffocating silence. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, as if the very atmosphere had become tainted by the presence of the mirror. Around him, black candles flickered weakly, their flames dancing in the cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. In his hand, he clutched the shard of the original mirror, its jagged edges biting into his palm, grounding him in the moment. This was it, the moment he would face the terror that had stalked him for weeks. His friends were there too, though they no longer felt like his friends. Lily stood in the corner, her eyes dark and distant, her movements slow and unnatural, as if she was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Mike, once so full of life, was now eerily silent, his gaze fixed on the mirror as if in a trance. Ethan could feel the presence of the doppelgangers within them, watching, waiting. They were already halfway gone, their true selves fading as the twisted reflections took over. Ethan's stomach churned with fear, but there was no turning back now. The ritual had to be completed, or they would all be lost. Ethan began to chant the ancient words, his voice trembling but steady. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, twisting unnaturally across the walls. The candles flickered wildly, their light barely cutting through the thickening gloom. As the final words left his lips, the mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the reflections within. His own reflection stared back at him, that same twisted grin stretching across its face, its eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. Ethan could feel it, Asterisk the keeper of mirrors asterisk, lurking just beyond the surface, waiting for him to falter. Suddenly, the mirror began to pulse with a dark energy, the fractured glass vibrating violently as if something inside was trying to break free. Ethan's breath hitched as the air grew impossibly cold, the temperature plummeting to freezing. His reflection moved on its own again, stepping forward in the glass, mimicking him, but with a sickening, exaggerated grace. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. The doppelganger was almost fully formed, a shadow version of Ethan that existed to take his place. As Ethan continued the chant, his friend started to change. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his with an unnatural intensity. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and she took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Mike followed suit, his movements jerky and inhuman, as though his body was no longer under his own control. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the terrifying truth. They weren't just watching anymore. The doppelgangers had taken full control of his friends. Panicking, Ethan tried to back away, but Lily reached out and grabbed his arm, her grip cold and unyielding. "It's time," she whispered, her voice no longer her own. "He's waiting for you." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, and he knew that the final confrontation was at hand. The Keeper of Mirrors was ready to claim him, just as it had claimed his friends. The mirror's surface rippled again, and this time, the glass began to crack further, pieces splintering off as something moved within. Ethan's reflection stepped out of the mirror entirely, standing before him, a perfect, yet distorted, copy of himself. The doppelganger smiled, its eyes gleaming with malice, and whispered, "You don't belong here anymore." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer terror of facing his own reflection, a reflection that wasn't bound by the rules of reality. The doppelganger moved closer, its movements fluid and predatory, as if it were stalking its prey. Ethan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as he realized he had to make a choice. The ritual had warned him. To defeat the Keeper, he must choose between himself and his reflection. One of them would remain in the real world, while the other would be trapped in the mirror forever. But Ethan didn't know how to make the choice. How could he tell if he was still himself? His mind raced with doubt. What if the doppelganger had already taken his place? What if he was the reflection? The doppelganger lunged at him, its cold fingers wrapping around his throat, choking the breath from his lungs. Ethan struggled, gasping for air as his vision blurred, but he knew what he had to do. With all his strength, he drove the shard of the original mirror into the doppelganger's chest. The creature recoiled, shrieking in pain as cracks spread across its body, its form distorting like shattered glass. But even as it crumbled, it smiled at him, a twisted, knowing grin that sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's heart. As the doppelganger dissolved into nothingness, Ethan collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The mirror's surface began to still, the dark energy dissipating as the ritual came to an end. His friends, now freed from the doppelganger's control, collapsed as well, unconscious but alive. The room was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the mirror's influence finally lifting. But as Ethan looked up at the cracked mirror, his heart sank. His reflection was still there, staring back at him. But something was different. It didn't move as he did. It stood perfectly still, that same twisted grin frozen on its face. Ethan's stomach twisted with dread as he realized the horrifying truth. He had won the battle, but the mirror wasn't finished with him. The reflection in the glass wasn't just a memory of the doppelganger. It was waiting, biding its time, ready to take his place the moment he let his guard down. Ethan had survived the night, but he knew deep down that the mirror's curse would never truly leave him. The reflection had been defeated, but its presence lingered, lurking just beyond the surface, waiting for the next moment of weakness. If you're ready for the final revelation and to see how Ethan's story truly ends, subscribe, like, and drop your theories in the comments. The mirror may have been cracked, but it's far from broken, and Ethan's fight isn't over yet. The reflection is still watching, waiting for its chance to return. Ethan sat in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, his heart still racing, his skin cold with fear. The candles had burned low, their flames flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. The mirror, now cracked beyond recognition, loomed before him like a broken gateway to another world. His friends, unconscious but alive, lay on the floor, the dark influence that had taken hold of them seemingly gone. For a moment, everything was still, and Ethan wanted to believe it was over. But deep inside, a gnawing fear told him otherwise. He stood slowly, his body aching from the encounter, and moved toward the mirror. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if some invisible force was pulling him back. The fractured glass reflected his weary face, the cracks distorting his image into a grotesque mosaic. His reflection stared back at him, motionless, its eyes unnervingly calm. For a second, Ethan thought it was over, thought he had finally defeated the terror that had haunted him for weeks. But then, his reflection blinked. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. He hadn't blinked. His reflection had acted on its own. A chill ran down his spine as the realization set in. The mirror's curse wasn't gone. It had only buried itself deeper, waiting, watching. The reflection smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of the lips, but it was enough to send a surge of terror through him. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The doppelganger hadn't been destroyed. It had merely retreated, waiting for the right moment to return. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to resume his normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every reflective surface felt like a window into another world, a world where something dark and twisted was always watching him. He avoided mirrors as much as possible, but reflections were everywhere. Puddles on the street, glass windows, even the shine on a polished floor. And in each one, he saw it, his reflection, staring back at him with that same unnerving stillness, always just a heartbeat away from moving on its own. His friends, too, were different. Though they had no memory of the ritual or the doppelgangers, Ethan could see the subtle changes in their behavior. Lily laughed, but her eyes didn't light up like they used to. Mike spoke with the same voice, but there was a strange detachment in his words, as if something deep inside had shifted. Ethan couldn't be sure if they had fully returned, or if part of the doppelgangers still lingered inside them, biding their time. The unease followed him everywhere. At night, the whispers returned, faint and distant, like echoes from the mirror world. Sometimes, Ethan would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was in the room with him, only to find his reflection in the darkened window, watching him with unblinking eyes. He began to question his own sanity, unsure if what he was seeing was real, or if the mirror had finally driven him mad. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, Ethan found himself back in front of the mirror, the reflection grinning at him, its eyes hollow and dark. In the dream, it would speak in a voice that wasn't his own, whispering terrible things, promises of what was to come, threats of what the mirror still held for him. "I'm still here," the reflection would say, its voice dripping with malice. "And I'm waiting." Ethan tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but the fear never went away. Every day, the reflection felt closer, its presence more tangible. He could feel it, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to cross over once again. The keeper of mirrors wasn't gone. It was simply waiting, patient as ever, for the next crack to appear, for the next moment of weakness. And then, one evening, it happened. Ethan was washing his hands in the bathroom sink when he glanced up at the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, as always. But this time, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the reflection raised its hand, pressing its palm against the glass. Ethan's heart froze. He hadn't moved an inch. The reflection smiled, and in that moment, Ethan knew. It was back star. The terror that surged through him was overwhelming, a primal fear that gripped him by the throat. The mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a doorway. The doppelganger had returned, and this time, it wouldn't stop until it took his place. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse racing, but the reflection remained at the glass, calm, patient. The cracks in the mirror seemed to spread, the fractures widening as the barrier between the two worlds weakened once again. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the horrifying truth. The mirror's curse would never end. It would follow him for the rest of his life, lurking in every reflection, waiting for the right moment to strike. No matter how many mirrors he shattered, no matter how far he ran, the Keeper of Mirrors would always be there, just on the other side, waiting to take what it believed was rightfully his. As the screen fades to black, the last thing you see is Ethan's reflection, smiling back at you through the cracks in the glass. And now, the question remains, what would you do if you knew your reflection wasn't just a reflection? If the mirror was more than just glass, but a doorway to something darker? Could you live with the knowledge that it was always watching, waiting for its chance to cross over? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the true nature of the mirror? Is Ethan doomed, or is there a way to escape the reflection's curse? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your theories with us. The story may be ending, but the reflection, it's far from over. And the next time you look into a mirror, just remember, something might be looking back.